When is the last time you listened to a podcast about web development, web design, and small business and didn't fall asleep? Yes, we cover web development, web design, and small business, but like actual human beings with personalities. If you're a beginner, we're not going to talk over your head. It's more like asking your buddy for help. We have guests, we have fun, and let me tell you, these two can get off on a tangent. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to HTML All the Things Podcast. This is Matt Lawrence and Mike Curran.
That's right, everybody. We are back. This is the HTML All the Things Podcast, and today we have a very interesting interview that I'm really excited to get out there. So today I sat down with Tom Barrasso from Cloud Phone, a company that is bringing modern phone features and apps to what's called feature phones or flip phones. These phones cost as little as $12. Tom enlightened me to the world of flip phones, where pricing and niche use cases keep them relevant in 2025. And when I say, flip phone or feature phone, I'm not talking about the modern flip phone with a foldable screen. I'm talking about, think about the original Motorola Razr back in, say, the early to mid 2000s, my high school era, basically, that original flip phone experience. Now, Tom is also the author of a podcast app for flip phones called PodLP. And this makes the modern podcast experience available to those that are not using traditional smartphones. Now, as somebody that used to be in the smartphone business back in the day when BlackBerry devices were popular, I used to work IT at BlackBerry. I had a great time kind of going down memory lane, talking about phones again. And this is a super interesting episode for anybody that's looking to potentially take advantage of these emerging markets by having modern apps actually get added and be accessible on these flip phones. So I hope that you enjoy this interview as much as I did. Let's just cut to it right now and get to it. All right, everybody, we have Tom on the line here. And before we jump into this loaded episode, Tom, what's up? How's it going? And what have you been working on?
Yeah, thank you for having me. The short answer is flip phones. They're still very much here, alive and well in 2025.
Yeah, you and I actually had a pretty interesting conversation on LinkedIn, because I'm from the BlackBerry days. I used to work at BlackBerry maybe 10, 12 years ago, something like that. When you were talking about flip phones, and I was like, you mean like, at first I'm kind of thinking, I guess the modern flip phone, the foldables where the screen is folding and you're flipping it open, like the new Razr, maybe the Samsung Flip, something like that, Samsung Fold. But no, you're talking like, kind of flip phones that are, I guess, more modern, but kind of like what I remember from high school, which is like the old school Motorola Razr from like the maybe early 2000s, I think early to late 2000s, something like that. So I guess like just to kind of give us a bit of an establishment, kind of just for the audience, to establish where we're coming from, can you give us some context on what segment of the industry you work for and why? And like, why'd you get into flip phones in the first place?
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction. So if you're thinking basically like old school Nokia or BlackBerry, you're much closer to what we're talking about than like the Samsung Z Flip or whatever fancy Motorola Razr thing they're selling for $1,200. These phones are actually about a hundredth of that price, about $12 is the lowest that they get down to. They're very basic, but they do now have 4G. So in terms of capabilities, they're actually far more capable than they were a decade ago. A lot of that has to do with server-side processing, basically to augment the hardware limitations that these devices have. And the story of how I got into them, I'll be brief here, but basically around 5 years ago, the pandemic happened. And like many people, I didn't have a commute, couldn't go to the gym, spent a lot of time at home, and was basically like, well, what do I do now? And my girlfriend at the time, she was joking with me and was saying, hey, you keep talking about wanting to do this digital detox thing, but you're never going to do it. I don't believe you because you like podcasts too much and there's no podcast app on these flip phones. And I was like, okay, well, I guess I could build one. I mean, right? I work in software. It can't be that hard. So I was learning about podcasting and how the indexes work, how to build an app, how the clients, how to set up a client. And basically I built the first podcast app, the first dedicated podcast app for flip phones about 5 years ago. And I released it. It was much more successful than I imagined. The first day I launched in the store in India, I had 250,000 organic downloads. Just a ton of people were curious what this new thing was. They were exploring the types of content that they could find. And yeah, here we are today, had over 10 million installs since I launched it. It's now on 3 different stores and 2 different platforms. And yeah, basically, I guess the message here is that Flip phones are still alive and well. They still sell a couple 100 million units a year. And it's really driven by affordability for millions around the world. The fact that you can have a device that sells as little as 12 US dollars unsubsidized, the whole cost of the device is that to you, is a huge, huge cost differential from, say, the cheapest Android phones in the world, which in India right now, I was doing some pricing research and we're looking at about 60 to 70 US dollars. So 5, 6, 7x, the cost of one of these feature phones. Yeah. So that's basically how I got into it. It's sort of an accident. I built a podcast app. It serendipitously became somewhat successful. And I learned a lot more about app development in this market segment. And basically, yeah, I connected with Cloud Mosa last year and have joined in developer relations since then, helping them build out their platform.
That's super interesting because, I mean, like, so many people would just assume that, like, going the cheap Android route, because there's obviously affordable Android phones, and then they themselves become more affordable as they age or as they, become a used device and they get refurbished and then sold somewhere. But I mean, they're not, like you said, they're not going to reach the level of $12. Like, that's, I mean, what are people paying for just the replacement on a screen on an iPhone? Like $300 now or something like that. Like, that's a very considerable, like, price differential. Like, that's pretty nuts.
Yeah,
What would you?
I think that's really the thing that I would just impress on people is the affordability is key to bringing on billions of people actually worldwide. I think the estimates right now from the GSMA are about 2.5 to 3 billion people have still never connected to the internet in any way, shape, or form. So,
Oh, wow.
we're still talking, it's not quite half the global population anymore. We are making inroads, but there's still a huge chunk of the world that primarily because of price have been unable to access this, interconnected world that we live in. And so having devices like this that can provide you with enough functionality, not the same sort of like, an app for everything in your pocket as you get with an iPhone, but enough functionality while still being affordable for people in emerging markets around the world who aren't able to afford, whatever the latest Apple iPhone is with, who knows, quantum liquid retina screens that have insane pixel densities. Yeah, just having a basic phone that allows them to call, text, access, online services.
What's interesting about this too is that we're starting to see a bit of a rise, or at least online. I keep seeing, like, not necessarily like dumb phones, but like more simple phones. Many of them are actually still Android, where it'll be like, oh, this one runs e-paper, or we'll see like a launcher for Android that's like very, very sort of like simple, sort of like, you don't want all the distractions or, things like that. It's like email, phone, a few more things, maybe Slack, something like that. And like, that's just what you get on these like more kind of simple phones. And I guess what I was going to ask there is, like, that's a method for Android to become a quote unquote like simpler phone, not a cheaper phone, but a simpler phone. But we've been mentioning like operating systems a bunch. And I'm just kind of wondering, like, back in the day, like back when I mentioned like the old Motorola Razr in the 2000s, that was running like, I don't even know what it was, right? Like, it wasn't running like an Android, it wasn't running like a Apple's iOS, it wasn't running something like that. So like, are the flip phones of today, are you seeing them be sort of like really fragmented by OS? Because back then I remember it was like every year you'd get something and maybe the same manufacturer would build off of what they did, but not necessarily. Like, they would just be like, oh, toss that out, get another one kind of thing.
Yeah, so I'll connect this to everyone listening to is probably wondering, like, what the heck does this have to do with web development and web apps here? So yeah, in terms of flip phone platforms, I think in the early days, like when you were talking about BlackBerry, the OG Motorola Razr, you had a whole bunch of different platforms. It really depended on the telco that you were working with as to what operating system they were on, what their network stack looked like. I think in the early days you had things like Brew was a popular system. Java 2 Mobile Edition, or J2ME, was a big one. So people used to build apps into jars using J2ME APIs. They would have a JAD or a Java descriptor that would basically say, like, these are the features that I want. And that lasted actually probably up until a few years ago, maybe around like 2018, 2019, when these things started to really drop off. Now you've got a whole plethora of systems. So yeah, you mentioned Android. Android is a relatively popular system on flip phones, mostly for the people who are looking for something with more capability, access to services like WhatsApp, Uber, some of the Spotify. But the big issue when we talk about Android is affordability and the minimum hardware requirements. I think Android's minimum since Android 8 have been 2 gigs of RAM, and I don't remember the CPU, maybe a quad core CPU. The phones that I've got here with Cloud Phone, which I'll talk about in a minute, This has 16 megabytes of RAM. That's megabytes, right? Something that we don't really think about anymore. I think 8 megabytes of ROM, the storage on this thing, it's the specs on these are just, completely night and day. So you get Android. KaiOS was a popular platform here. So I don't know if folks remember Firefox OS from back in the day, but it was basically like Mozilla's attempt to compete with Android in the early 2010s. And it didn't quite get very far. I don't remember if they really had a commercial partner. Like you could sort of load this onto a few devices that were already bootloader unlocked, but it wasn't something that you could go into Best Buy and pick up a Firefox OS phone. So it never really went very far, but it lived on. The team ended up shifting focus to build a platform for feature phones called KaiOS. So basically the whole operating system is a Firefox browser. That sits, they call them smart feature phones. So it sits somewhere between one of these basic 4G feature phones and one of these Android smartphones, both in terms of price and in terms of the capabilities of the device. And then now you have a couple of different platforms. The OSs aren't really important because the OSs are all done by the manufacturers. They're all some sort of RTOS or a real-time operating system. They're all proprietary. They're all chipset specific. But now you've got a platform with the company that I work for, Cloud Phone, which is basically a remote browser, kind of like Opera Mini is today, in that you have a server that sits between your phone and the website that you're accessing that will do the transcoding, it'll do all of the rendering, and it will compress it and send it down to the device onto a thin client. And we can go more into the architecture that makes all this possible, but basically you have phones with 16 megs of RAM that can watch TikTok videos, they can talk with ChatGPT and access all the modern websites that you have come to use pretty often. They can render progressive web apps, even games, and you can do this all on these devices with very little hardware thanks to this technology. So yeah, in terms of platforms, you basically have Android on the upper end, KaiOS in the mid-market, and then basic feature phones with Cloud Phone sort of in the budget or the more affordable category. And that's probably roughly how the devices sell. The cheaper units sell probably 10x what the more expensive units do.
That's interesting. So I guess because I guess most people, if they go away from the sort of, I guess the popular guys like the iOS and the Android, like they would be going for something that's like admittedly like quite a lot cheaper. So they wouldn't go for like the high end cheaper, because then you're kind of approaching Android. I would imagine you would go for like the stuff that's like I don't know what the range would be, but like 12 at the bottom, and then whatever, maybe up to 100 or something like that. I was going to ask though, like you mentioned, obviously like with Cloud Phone, like a lot of the stuff is being kind of processed and like you said, transcoded and such on the cloud. Is there, I don't know if you mentioned it, but is there like a subscription fee or anything for that? Like for all that hosting and that type of thing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So Cloud Phone's built from the company CloudMosa that made the Puffin browser. Puffin was a browser originally developed in the early Android days, basically solving the same problem. In the early Android days, you had issues where the devices did not have the hardware requirements needed to render complex websites. And Google Chrome, back in the day, the web views that were built into Android, let's say like 2.0, they were just awful. If anyone, I actually developed first in the Motorola Droid, and if you could get a website to work that wasn't just like static text and some links, then you were doing pretty good. And so, yeah, Puffin basically was able to solve the same problem it's doing today, but now it's doing it in a even further down market category, which are these feature phones. But no, the users don't pay subscription fees. It's all bundled into the unit cost of the device. And yeah, basically, because they've had over a decade to optimize the way that their data centers work, they're able to keep fixed costs quite low. And because these devices are considerably smaller, right? They have really small 240 by 320 QVGA screens, or even QQVGA, which is half that size. So they've got really small screens. They don't have touch screens. They just have keyboard buttons. So then the amount of data that goes back and forth across the wire is quite small. Yeah, basically, it's really about keeping costs low so that you can provide these sets of services and limiting the types of things that you can do on these devices, right? You're not getting 3 million apps like you have in Google Play today, which, to be fair, would be kind of a challenge to navigate on a tiny screen typing on T9.
I didn't even think about that. Going back to T9 would be a struggle. My first phone, I made sure I was like, I'm going to get, it was resistive touch. It was called the Samsung forever, but I was like, I'm making sure I get the full QWERTY because I know how to like, type with kind of home row in that. So I was like, back then I had just learned to do that. So I was like, man, I'm making sure I get that full QWERTY keyboard if I turn this thing, in landscape, because I just couldn't wrap my head around the T9. I guess I didn't really expose myself to it, but going back to it though, for whatever little I did, it would be quite a journey.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty impressive now. I'll say T9 is a little bit tricky, but if you have a good system with predictive text, it can be a bit easier. And then, yeah, when we start to dive into like the capabilities of devices, they have microphones. And if you're doing server-side processing, like on your own server, you can host speech-to-text processing so that you can like, one of the apps that the Cloud Phone has is Google Gemini. You can talk into it and have it do the real-time speech to text transcoding and then show it on the screen and have the user like chat with an AI agent or whatever, or just transcribe their message if you want to make things a little bit easier. Of course, now you're going to need to think about the types of language models you need to load for all the different languages out there. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty, the possibilities are pretty wild when you think about like being able to connect the web to some of the, most underserved communities around the world.
That is actually like really fascinating, especially with the like expanded capability. Because I mean, like back in the day, it was like I think at most my old phone could do like Twitter, and it was through like some like app called like Tweetor or something. It was like something that someone made up. Like definitely, it wasn't widespread, but and it like kind of worked. It was like you clicked a button and it would load a tweet. You clicked another button, it would load another tweet. And it took forever. So to hear that these devices are like running TikTok and like talking to Gemini and things like that is very, very impressive. I did actually want to talk actually about that. So one of the things that you mentioned was when we were having a chat on LinkedIn was some of these devices have as little as 16 megabytes of RAM. And I wanted to like kind of discuss that because obviously we're talking a little bit about the special considerations you need to take because of the lack of hardware there. But that is like a particularly low amount of RAM, especially because you mentioned 2 gigabytes minimum required for quite a while on Android now. So, I mean, obviously some stuff you can offload to the cloud, but your podcast app, if I remember correctly, is actually like just like a native app, right? So like what type of considerations did you have to take with that?
Yeah, so I'll actually correct that. My podcast app, PodLP, is available on Cloud Phone. So it's a web-based app that
Okay.
runs on Cloud Phone. So it's not a native app built into these phones. And then the other one, I guess you could semi-native, but it's still web-based for KaiOS, which is the one that I launched originally 5 years ago. So yeah, I guess in terms of device limitations, again, it depends on the platform we're talking about. So when I built PodLP 5 years ago, one of the challenges with building for KaiOS is that, first of all, KaiOS has two major versions, 2.5 and 3.0. 90% of the devices around the world are running KaiOS 2.5. That means that you're targeting Gecko 48. That's Firefox 48. So think about writing for a browser that is, I don't even know, what are we on, 128, more than that now? So like
Oh
60
no.
versions outdated from 2015. You don't get ES6, so you're still on ES5. You do get promises, which they have, but no async await. So you're doing a lot of transpiling to get it to work. I think you do get CSS grid, but like basically anything after that's out of scope. So you have to do a lot of work to fit your web app to get it to work onto KaiOS. And on top of that, you have hardware limitations because the apps run on the device. So you have to be really considerate in terms of, watching out for memory leaks. Like as an example, when I first launched PodLP, I remember, naturally Joe Rogan podcast is one of the top podcasts in the world. I think after my first week of launching, I had reports of fatal crashes because people were downloading podcasts. And in my mind, none of the podcasts that I listened to were more than an hour. I guess I just don't have that attention span. But somebody downloaded Joe Rogan and they kept crashing the app and they were like, what's going on? And I looked into it and it ran out of memory because I did a fetch to download the whole thing and then store it as a blob in, I think, IndexedDB at the time. And so then I had to actually build it out so it would do like a chunk stream and it would, download bytes and append it to a blob somewhere so that you're not actually accumulating in memory that much space. Now, Cloud Phone, on the other hand, because of the way that it works with the server-side rendering, you basically don't have any of those considerations. First of all, it's running a very recent version of Chromium. So I think it's currently Chromium 128, but it's constantly being updated. So you have access to all of the modern features. You've got everything from whatever the latest, new CSS styles are, variables, grid, layout, etc. You've got all the JavaScript language features. So you're not running a polyfill. You're not doing transpilation in Babel. You've got access to WebSockets for real time. We're working on WebRTC and push. Those aren't available yet, but those are two things that we're building out. WASM is there. I mean, there's just so many features that you get with that. And they run on server, so you don't really need to worry about the memory footprint. The system itself, the Cloud Phone system, the client and the server will handle doing chunk streaming. They'll handle compression. They'll handle transcoding and fitting it on the screen. So really all you have to worry about is the features that your app has, making and then really scaling them down to fit. But yeah, so like I guess it really depends. As a web developer, if you're targeting KaiOS, you're going to need to spend some time thinking about optimizations, refactoring. You may even need to switch the library or framework you're using, because if you're using a really heavy library like React and pulling in a bunch of components, it might just not work well on that platform. If you're targeting Cloud Phone, none of that really matters. You don't need to think about optimization, but you still need to think about UI and how to present things efficiently, how to do keyboard navigation. Yeah, those are really the things as a developer that you need to worry about, because the platform will otherwise take care of them.
That's super interesting. Yeah, because I mean, like way back in college now, we did, I mean, a lot of like integrated circuits, and we did I mean, not real time OSs, but like, real time operations. Like we'd like pretend that this is a car door, and like it's in a lab. So you're like, when the beam breaks or when this magnet disengages, like this device will send a beeper. They can make it start beeping, kind of thing. And like that was, I want to say we had like 16 or 32 kilobytes, maybe might have been bytes of RAM. And so like 60 megabytes is a far cry from that. But also like, I know for sure that like I've built websites for clients where it's like, a new rig will turn on its cooling system. Like a new computer will turn on its cooling system. So it's super interesting to hear like there's like ways around this.
Yeah, I mean, I think when Cloud Phone was being proposed, it really came down to like we had to figure out a way so that developers didn't need to worry about this. In part because by enabling that with these servers, you enable so much that already exists today to be brought over to this platform with relatively little effort. So you're lowering the barrier to entry for developers and improving the DevX. But also, if you think about like you're saying, from if you've worked in real-time systems before as a developer, it's really hard. There's a lot of things you need to worry about. Memory leaks are a huge problem. The scheduler can just tell you at any point, nope, you're done. You need to stop executing because a phone call is coming in. So cease all operations. And because there's so little RAM and ROM, you don't actually get to store state ephemerally on the device. You can't be like, let's take my whole, like if you're using React and Redux and you're so used to taking your entire application state and then just like JSONifying into a blob and storing it somewhere, you could not do that on these devices if you were writing a native app. It would not be possible. So all these concepts that you're used to today just they would not work because how little RAM and ROM basically the hardware that these devices have. But, that's the whole point of having something like Cloud Phone, is that it builds out a system that enables you to do all of that without needing to really care. Not to mention the fact that like these phones run different chipsets, and would you really want to have to write multiple native apps, one for each of the different chipsets and handle each of the specific APIs, right? So it's really trying to obfuscate all of that away.
Well, I know that like when we were running our own core files, which is effectively like a driver. And then we were also writing, this is again, like back in college, we were writing earlier than that, we did assembly. And it was just like, when we were talking to people, they were like, yeah, like sometimes what you'll need like one of the chips to be, in assembly, you'll need to talk to it in assembly. And then you'll need to have this other one be this. And like you were saying, memory leaks were a huge problem. So I had like an input on like a little LCD, and then found out that I couldn't enter the last letter because I like maxed out. I basically set it so that the amount of letters I could enter was I think like maybe 10 or something, depending on how long the screen was. And it was just for like a save file. It was like couldn't enter that last letter because it couldn't handle that while it was like preparing the save function. And it was just like, what are we doing? Like, what are we doing here?
Oh man, yeah. It's mind-blowing when you get to hardware this low, especially in modern web development, where you're so used to like grabbing the latest laptop with I think now 16 gigs is like becoming effectively de facto on a laptop. Phones, I think even the lowest end iPhones are like 4 gigs, maybe 6 now. There's Android phones with like 32 gigs of RAM. And then there are these phones here with like 16 to 64 megabytes of RAM. And so orders of magnitude, it creates a totally different set of engineering challenges to actually be able to, build and reliably maintain on these systems. So yeah, that's really what Cloud Phone's trying to do, is make it so that developers can focus on building the core experience that will help serve these users without needing to think about all of these really difficult and annoying problems or limitations.
What do you like? So for that type of stuff, like for the limitations in that, I mean, I know like a lot of developers, even probably listening to this show, are probably being like, man, I don't know if I want to get into something like that. And I know, like, to kind of compare that situation, I know that a lack of developers, meaning app developers, third-party ones, really didn't help BlackBerry out. Like that was a big thing on BlackBerry World, which was the app store on Blackberries. There was a lack of apps. There wasn't an official Facebook app. Like BlackBerry made the Facebook app with the APIs and everything that was available at the time from Facebook, for example. And so like we did have like a lack of apps if you were using BlackBerry. And so how is that for you right now? I mean, are you having a lot of devs kind of come to you guys? Do you have to seek them out? Is there a lot of convincing maybe when you're like, hey, it's not actually that bad if it's on Cloud Phone? You don't have to go back to like, moving registers around and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very fair comparison. I would say right now it's a little bit of both. So we work with a number of companies that are already in this space, and so they're more than happy to target this platform. And definitely Cloud Phone's the easiest to get into if you're going to get into this space for a variety of reasons. I don't think we've touched on the full developer experience yet, but to compare it, so let's say if this were 2010 and you had a J2ME phone, you would have to figure out how to sideload a jar file onto your phone. And because your phone may or may not have had Bluetooth, it probably couldn't connect to the internet, didn't have a browser. First of all, like user discovery was a huge problem, and so distribution was a concern. Some of them had the OV store and enabled you to sideload, but it was by far was complicated, fragmented, and the capabilities that you had access to were quite limited. And because they were native apps, you really had to care about all of these performance considerations we talked about. KaiOS made it a bit easier. The pitch was like, hey, this is a web app. You could just take your web app today. You can, run it through Babel. You can transpile it to ES5. You can remove some features. You can change the design and then put it into a zip file with your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and run it on the phone. But again, it still was actually quite a bit of work. You had to do a lot of testing, and actually getting a hold of one of these devices and being able to put it into dev mode was a problem because the manufacturers obviously didn't want that. And so many of these manufacturers would have SE Linux to prevent you from being able to root them so that you couldn't necessarily access ADB to do side loading. So it wasn't impossible, and certain devices were available for testing. Although on KaiOS 3, they're actually still to this day, I think it launched in 22. Now we're 3 years in, and there's still no commercially available device for developers to test against. None of them have debug enabled or can be debug enabled without, going through a whole process, unlocking the bootloader. So yeah, and then Cloud Phone makes that much easier. Any device that you buy a Cloud Phone can be dev enabled because it's all server side. All we have to do is, it's kind of like Android. You go to settings you tap 7 times on soft left, and it will ask you, do you want to be a developer? You click yes. You put your IEMI in on the Cloud Phone console, and now you can put any website you want on Cloud Phone and test it out. So the pitch, yeah, it's really to lower the barrier to entry so that all the existing PWAs out there today, everyone who's been building a web app, can really just think about like, okay, I type in the URL. Okay, maybe I need to do some style tweaks to get it to fit the small screens and stuff, but it should more or less work. There shouldn't be major functional gaps. It'll do audio and video, something Opera Mini never did. So you can, like I said, TikTok or PodLP for podcasts. It can do HLS, so HTTP live streaming. But yeah, in terms of getting developers, yeah, I think it's sort of it's a bit of both. The people who are already there and interested in this market are really happy and eager with the space. But if you've been focused on building a really complex experience on iOS, and you're really into Swift, or if you're on Android and Kotlin, and you don't have the web experience, or you're not interested in this type of demographic, which is predominantly lower income, emerging markets, places like India, Pakistan, Vietnam, countries around Africa. So if that demographic isn't something that you're interested in, then it doesn't really matter that these phones have this capability. You're probably not going to pay a lot of attention to them. And that's probably the difference between BlackBerry and Cloud Phone, right? BlackBerry was targeting a Western audience, more affluent consumers, prosumers interested in like security conscious, privacy conscious, and they wanted a keyboard. And these phones today are predominantly emerging markets, people who just simply can't afford the cheapest Android phone and are looking for access to basic services.
So I have, I guess, a question on that too. So like, Cloud Phone's making it easier for these more complex, apps, or I guess like more modern apps, and people who are developers that are more familiar with a more modern developing environment, the more modern code, things like that. They're not diving into assembly. They're not writing drivers kind of thing to get these apps on these devices. But one thing I'm noticing just sort of like overall is that a lot of people are worried about digital availability. They're worried about excessive screen time. And this has kind of been plaguing humans really since, smartphones started hitting the scene probably in the late 2000s, early 2010s kind of thing. And, we're just starting to see people kind of like, well, usually there's a YouTube video about it where they say, I'm doing a digital detox. They get themselves a dumb phone, maybe an iPod on top of that. If they take it further, maybe even a digital camera, and then they kind of like do this digital detox. So, I mean, this is kind of contrary to bringing all these apps, like these more modern apps, onto something like a flip phone, because they may, see a flip phone and just be like, oh yeah, like that's a dumb phone. Like, I won't have access to the TikTok and to Gemini and all these different things. So does this sort of digital detox movement like really affect your industry at all? Like, is it becoming maybe less niche and more mainstream in a way? Like, are you selling more phones, but the people aren't using it to the fullest or something? Or, or do you think this is maybe just like temporary nostalgia and maybe just like something that people are doing on YouTube? Like, what do you think?
Yeah, it's absolutely a fascinating movement. I think you're stitching together a couple of different ideas. So digital detoxers, yeah, it's definitely a market, and it's a pretty present market in the feature phone space. So if you're in the dumb phone community, or if you're in the EDC, like the everyday carry, a lot of people are moving to these devices to disconnect. They want something simpler. They need something that isn't quite as addictive. And so there is this really, especially if you follow r/dumb phones, it's a really tricky balancing act, because you do want a dumbed down experience if you're a digital detoxer. You don't want the 3 million apps that you have on Google Play. You don't want all the push notifications and all the, focus and attention grabbing features that these phones were built with. It's really tricky because you don't want nothing either. You don't want just calls and texting, and everybody wants a different subset of it, right? Some people want maps, and maps is the thing they need because they need it to navigate, and they're not good at directions, or they travel a lot. Some people like PodLP. I've had a lot of users reach out and tell me that it's a godsend because they listen to podcasts all the time, and it's infinitely easier to have a podcast app that you can just open, stream, or download and do it all there, rather than have to like hook it up to your computer and download all the MP3s and put them on there, and then hope that the podcasters have added the ID3 tags with the album art and the names and stuff. And if they didn't, then your music player is just going to completely freak out and have no idea how to handle them. So yeah, the effort required for stuff like that, to have it on your screen, and different people are going to choose different experiences here. But to try to put numbers to this movement, the feature phone sales in the US alone are actually about 2.5 to 3 million units a year, which I think people find boggling. It's like, what? Like, why are 3 million people in the United States buying feature phones? And the answer really is like, a core demographic is definitely seniors, older folks who either want or need just like that basic functionality to call their family, to have an emergency contact button, stuff like that. But another demographic is, and is growing, the digital detoxers. Even on PodLP, I still have thousands of monthly active listeners coming from the United States, and it's a very steady market. So it's definitely not the largest market, but if you're interested in building apps for feature phones and you don't really care about this emerging market world, but you do want to target the sort of subset of the market, you still can do that. And it's still, I think it's large enough that it's absolutely worth targeting if you're able to and interested in building in the niches, right? Because there's less competition in the feature phone space, so you can stand out much easier. It's free. You're not paying subscription fees to Apple or to Google to publish apps. And the users are just far more eager. Like I said, when I launched PodLP in India, and I had got 250,000 organic installs the very first day, I didn't pay for any one of those. That's, a huge departure from like, I used to be an Android developer for many years, and it got more and more and more expensive to actually acquire users. When I first launched my first app on Android, it went on Google Play. I don't even know, thousands, tens of thousands of downloads, instantly organic, didn't pay for a single thing. I was in high school at the time, so I didn't even know how to do that. And by the time I left, like, I don't know, 6 or 8 years after that, I think the cost per install is like $4 or $5 now, for which like, that means if you're going to get 5,000 new users on your Android app, unless you figure out how to like memify it, and you're really good at marketing, you're going to be spending thousands and thousands of dollars to acquire new users. So there's absolutely a reason to focus in the space, but of course there's limitations too. Again, other than the digital detoxers, most of the users in this segment are not going to have money to pay for stuff. So if you're like, oh, I'm going to build an app and charge my users $5 a month, well, if you spent $12 on a phone and you're spending $3 to top up your data plan, you're probably not going to spend $5 a month to access some app, unless it's, solves every problem you can imagine. It like handles bank transfers, and it gives you free messaging, and who knows what all the different user needs are. So unless you're targeting some sort of like unbelievable super app, this demographic is not a demographic that you can, charge and really monetize directly through in-app purchases or paid app subscriptions.
It's a really good point about the different use cases, because like the very first thing I think of is so many people are, I was going to say addicted, but maybe not addicted, but they rely on a certain app, something like a Slack or like a Discord for work, especially if like their company talks to them via Slack, or if they're, they're a streamer or something and their people talk to them via Discord. It's like, that's work to them, and they have to have that. They can't just be like, oh, like, sorry, I didn't have my laptop open kind of thing, like every couple of minutes.
Well,
No,
funny thing about that too is now you have companies that actually want these devices. So like we've worked with manufacturers who will build stripped down dumb phones that they want to give to people on like factory floors. No cameras for security purposes. They don't want anyone to bring in their personal phone to be able to take photos of stuff. And they'll work to have just the experiences that they want on these phones. So they'll say, while you're on the factory floor, we only give you access to these apps. And of course, you're on our corporate network. So we're limiting the things that you can do. And yeah, I mean, in many cases, it makes sense if you're working with a lot of proprietary stuff, if you're working in, clean environments where you can't have, the risk of somebody introducing their personal phone and all the germs that come on it. Or so there's a bunch of context where it's actually like the affordability is helpful to companies buying these in bulk, and the ability to control the experience of what is and is not available is pretty, important to that segment. So there's a lot of like niche use cases too. But definitely, if you're a developer, I would say like the big market is emerging markets. That's what you go for if you really want to maximize the feature phone development space. And then if you're not interested in that, but you still want to go after a pretty valuable segment, you can go after the digital detox or niche. Senior citizens, basically like the Western audience that does have money, is able to afford, either in purchases or, that you could serve ads to and monetize. So yeah, different segments. And it's kind of, it's fascinating having the two extremes, having some of the poorest in the world who are connecting to the internet for the very first time, and then having like people who've had smartphones for a decade and are choosing to give them up now because of the influence it's had on their lives.
Absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, like the digital availability like is a thing for people, right? Where it's like every 2 minutes, was almost, I mean, it kind of started with the BlackBerry with the blinking red light, and everyone's like, flip the BlackBerry down at night or turn that light off, because like if you wake up and you just like roll over and you see the blinking red light, it's like, is that an important message? you know, like what is that? Crawl out of bed, grab it. It wasn't. It was an Amazon ad or something. Put it back in the dock and go back to bed, kind of thing. But you mentioned something there that we were going to discuss too, which is, seniors using this. So you mentioned like sort of the people that are the niche use cases, detoxing, maybe in the specific factory use cases, like you mentioned. There's also the people that the demographic where they, they're on a tight budget. What about seniors? Because I do see, like some, funny enough, my one friend, for some reason, he got stuck on the newsletter for a senior centric carrier that's like a local one here. And so he keeps getting these ads, and he always like sends it to us. He's like, take a look at these like, ads or whatever. And there's usually 2 or 3 like flip phones in there, like really big flip phones. So like, are you seeing, seniors and maybe some older folks like still use these flip phones?
Yeah, short answer is absolutely. So again, with PodLP, it was funny because some of the largest, like the most consumed content, one category is religion, by podcast category. And so in India, that's really big for like Hindu worship. There's a lot of like spiritual and devotional content that people listen to. But also in the United States, I've got a lot of folks that listen to church services, sermons, stuff like that through PodLP. I've also seen like a lot of programming targeting or geared towards older folks. And they're even making special devices designed for that segment now. So they've got bigger buttons, brighter screens. They're meant to just be, the interfaces are really simplified, dumbed down so that it really just focuses in on the things that they care about, right? So if you've never used a smartphone, you just don't care about all these things, but you still want the ability to talk to your family. Even now having speech to text is huge. If you think about like your OG Eraser from whatever that, almost 20 years ago now, that would be so much harder to use than if you can just flip open your big Alcatel device, click the center button and say, call my daughter or send this message. And that's how it's such a natural interface for that demographic. And so, yeah, I think everybody's trying to figure out exactly what is the right set of features and functionality that is what that demographic is really after. And so it's definitely evolving, but it's certainly large enough that you can't really ignore it, right? Enough that you have manufacturers building specialty devices.
And that is absolutely what we see. Like when I said like that, like my buddy would like send us the pictures of the ads and be like, why are there still flip phones in here, kind of thing. But that's exactly what they were, like large Alcatel ones, like very, very bright screen, or like very, very bright backlight on the lights on the keypad, with the keypad being, large print, things of that nature. One of them had like a safety light, one had like a drop. I think I don't know if all these were Alcatel, but one of them had like a drop detector or whatever, like if you fall, a fall detector if you fell, kind of thing. And like that totally makes sense, To be honest, I can kind of see myself doing this now, because I'm definitely the person where I get to my phone and I'm like, where did I message that person? Like, was it Messenger? Was it Messages? Was it this? Was it that? It's like I would love to just flip open and be like, text Bill, like, golf tomorrow, let's go, kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean,
Rather
it's
than
pretty
like,
cool, right? I've seen one that even has hearing aid integration now, so that it can, instead of having to switch your hearing aids out and put in headphones to be able to listen to what the device is saying, you can just have it. I don't know what it speaks over. Maybe it's Bluetooth or something else, but like the phone will integrate with your hearing aid so that it can transmit the audio from your phone to your hearing aid. And yeah, the big buttons are really important. I've had people reach out to me at PodLP saying that they love it because you get two very different contexts. I had a young guy who was like, "Oh, I'm always in the mountains, I'm skiing, I'm kayaking, and I always have gloves on." And to be able to press the buttons and have a rugged phone that's like waterproof and all the stuff, he's like, that's how I use my device now. And I've had a senior reach out and say like, I have one of these Alcatels with big buttons, and like I have arthritis, and it's amazing because I could never use the smartphone because I don't have the like dexterity in my fingers to be able to navigate all of these complex small little interactions on the phone. But like to be able to just have these big buttons that I can click and listen to my podcast, I can put it on the home screen and I just open PodLP and I go right to whatever it is I'm the latest news programming or something. So yeah, I think I think that's the really incredible thing, is the ability to really like help out this demographic and really like impact people's lives in completely unforeseen ways, because yeah, you're really focusing in on a diverse and but still underserved market.
yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean, it's just like another one of those niches, really, right? Where it's like how the factory floor didn't want the cameras and they wanted very specific apps on there, maybe like something that could like it would show the people their time codes or something like that for certain orders in manufacturing or something like that, versus like like the senior that just needs like assistance, which is good. Or I mean, the person in the mountains needs assistance. They can't be like, hang on guys, pull the glove off and messing around and be like, everybody stop skiing for a moment. Like, I gotta like, next episode of Joe Rogan or something, whatever they listen to out in the mountains. I kind of wanted to take this opportunity now, I think, to kind of dive into, like, you kind of mentioned the full developer experience. So like maybe you could walk us through something like that. So if it's something like, let's just say someone's listening to this right now, they are, they're making websites now, making web apps now, and they're like, this is kind of interesting. This topic is kind of interesting. I'd like to dive in. What's the procedure like? Like, what is that developer experience like?
Yeah, so I'll focus on Cloud Phone so I don't overwhelm with all of the different platforms here. And obviously, it's the one that I know best right now. So if you're interested in Cloud Phone, the very first thing you can do is go to our website, cloudphone.com, but that's Phone. So cloudphone.com. And there's a link to the developer program where you can access the developer console. All you do is type in your email. There's no passwords. It just sends you a magic link that you can access a console. And you can take any PWA, any app, web app that you have today that's hosted. So it has to have a URL, right? It could even be a GitHub Pages URL. And on our GitHub, we have starter repos that you can see on how to write apps with all the popular frameworks and then how to deploy them to GitHub Pages. So it doesn't matter where you're hosting. You could be on Cloudflare. You could have something AWS, it could be self-hosted. As long as accessible on the public internet, you put it in there. And then you can click launch on the simulator. So if you're in Google Chrome, you can launch the simulator and it will render basically a little QVGA screen on your desktop that will show you. It's not so the simulator, it's certainly a little bit more complicated than it looks, but from a developer experience, that's really all you need to worry about. It actually is running the Cloud Phone client, but it's running it obviously in a server. It's not running it on one of these feature phones, and it's rendering it to the same screen output so that you can see what your app would look like and feel like. You can use the keyboard that you'd have for keyboard navigation using the arrow keys. You can also just click on the keyboard on the user interface. And yeah, you could build and test totally within the Cloud Phone simulator. And then you can click publish and it will send us basically a message to begin a QA process to evaluate the app. That would basically be the easiest path. Now, of course, like I have a bunch of these devices. I love to be able to test on a physical device. It's also great to be able to like build marketing collateral to promote. You can take photos of these devices and post them on all the different social media to talk about your app. You can take screen grabs and stuff, and you can like pull those, into some sort of promotional website that you've got, a landing page, talk about it. But yeah, if you want one of these devices, we have a devices page on our website. So we have a developer portal. It lists all the commercially available devices today. Or you can just reach out to us. In many countries, we can send you one of these 4G phones for free, a developer unit that's specifically built for developers. And we're working on Wi-Fi models too. Kind of wild, but yeah, there are versions of these phones that come with Wi-Fi support, which from a developer perspective, I think that will unlock a lot of, it'll certainly improve the DevX. So you're not like dealing with, SIM cards and subscriptions to, sort of like budget telcos to be able to access Cloud Phone. But yeah, like I mentioned, you enable dev mode just by going into Cloud Phone and you click the settings and about and soft left 7 times, and all that's documented on our website. And then you copy your IEMI number over to the portal, and then you can just have all the apps that you're testing available on your phone. You can see what they're like on a physical device. Yeah, I mean, it's not, I think that the major, distinction is because it uses the server rendering technology. There's no like concept of pushing via ADB. You're not like building and then pushing to the device. You're publishing to some sort of server, and then Cloud Phone is going to render whatever you have available on that server today. So yeah, and we've got a bunch of documentation out there, and I'm working to add more. So if there's any questions people have, they can reach out to me directly, and I can write up articles, answer questions about the features that are and aren't available. Because yeah, like I said, some things are under development, some things work perfectly today, some things we might never build for this platform, just because the set of web APIs available today is massive, and the set of web APIs that are relevant to not just this demographic, but this device category is maybe just a limited subset. So yeah.
Do you find do any developers complain? Because like one of the things I was thinking of is I do quite a lot of front end work, like a lot of like say Figma to an actual a UI on a website. And you were mentioning the size of some of these screens. And so like some of these web apps will have, something docked like maybe a sticky nav bar, and then they'll have like a sticky like bottom bar where there's, a camera button or other utilities for the app itself, entering QR codes or whatever you're doing. And so like that won't really like fly with like a tiny screen, because it's like, well, I got about 4.5 pixels in the middle where I could scroll down. Do you see anybody kind of like talk about that or complain about that, and kind of say like, hey, I had to make like a separate version? Like, is there a scaling thing that's happening at all? Like, what do you think on that?
I haven't had anyone tell me that they had to make a separate version. I mean, I think if you're willing to target this demographic and this device category, you're probably willing, or at least upfront, that these have small screens, right? So anyone thinking today, oh, I want to test out feature phone development, like they have small screens. There's no way around it. You're not getting the same experience that you have on an iPhone today. So if you've already got a PWA or a web app and you want to scale it down for this target, first off, I'll tell you, no library or framework is going to have breakpoints this small. So you're going to have to manually override them. I think the very smallest in Bootstrap or Tailwind is like 500 and something pixels, which is almost double what the biggest of these screens have, right? Again, I mentioned there's two screens that Cloud Phone's on today. Probably there'll be more in the future, but there's QVGA, which is 240 by 320, and QQVGA, which is 128 by 160. And that one is really hard to scale down to.
Real small.
For that one, PodLP has all the titles have an animation, a marquee animation, so that when you select over a podcast thumbnail, it will render the title at the top of the screen and it will marquee it over so that you can read the whole thing. Because you're not going to have even titles on the grid items, because now you're talking about having a title that renders across 60 pixels with a little bit of padding. So they're very small. Just say that up front. Very small screens. You will not be building the full experience. The checklist that I sort of run through mentally when we're onboarding folks that are looking to adapt their PWA is: one, get rid of your install banners, because there's no concept of installation, so you don't need them. Basically, get rid of all banners. There's no need for banners. Pop-ups, really only full page interstitials if you absolutely need to, like getting explicit user consent for something, whether that's cookies or some other technology. Logins really only when necessary. And if you're going to do logins, please do OAuth so that they can log into an account they've already signed into, like a Google account. Nobody wants to type out emails and passwords on these phones. and this type of demographic probably can't even remember them. And so if they've signed into one when they bought the device, just let them use that account. So if you can use OAuth, trying to think if you go, oh yeah, sticky navs, get rid of sticky navs, make them not sticky. That one's pretty easy today because position sticky is so well supported. Probably most people just need to add a conditional style that says like if cloud phone or if not touch or if something, then make position relative and then just keep it at the top and then just scale down. But again, one of the benefits of cloud phone versus say like KaiOS is there's a lot less that you have to worry about, not just optimization, but like you don't need to worry about asset management because CloudPhone will do the transcoding and scale it down. Because of how it works, CloudPhone's only going to be sending a image the size of the screen to the client or a vector representation of it. So you don't need to worry about like another example from PodLP, podcast thumbnails and artwork, traditionally now about 3000 by 3000 pixels for targeting like high resolution screens like the iPhone and desktops. The very first version of PodLP didn't have thumbnails. The second did. And some artwork crashed PodLP because it ran out of memory trying to render that directly. So I had to put in a server that would like, build up. It would do the scaling down to generate thumbnails that were like 128 pixels to fit the screen appropriately. But on CloudPhone, it doesn't matter because the servers that CloudPhone has is already going to do that when it sends the representation down to the client. So there's just a lot less in terms of that type of hassle that you need to worry about. Same with like audio codecs or video codecs. You don't need to care. Basically anything that works in Google Chrome today will work on CloudPhone, with the one exception being any DRM content. Just because of CloudPhone's architecture, DRM's not possible today. So possibly in the future, but probably a ways away.
With something like Cloud Phone, I know you mentioned, Wi-Fi, and then obviously there's other hardware like bits on the actual piece of hardware. Is there any sort of hardware access? Like if someone says, I mean, I guess it would have to be Google. If Google says, you know what, I want to put Google Meet on one of these devices, can they access, like if there is a front-facing camera, you did say there's a microphone, I remember earlier in the show, can they access hardware kind of like you would with a web browser to have a call and things like that?
Yeah, so in terms of like web API availability, it comes down to basically what the Cloud Phone client supports. And there's multiple versions of the Cloud Phone client. We're constantly adding new features to it. So yeah, today, the latest versions of Cloud Phone support microphone and camera access. So you can access both of those. You can access local files for uploads and downloads, just one file at a time. You can't get like a file system representation. You just, like input type as file, like ask the user to give me a file or, an anchor tag with a download attribute that lets you download a file. So that's all possible today. We don't have WebRTC yet, but we are building out exactly as you described for things like Google Meet so that we could do like peer-to-peer connections so that you could have direct access to the camera and be able to like video chat or audio chat with your friends and family. We're working on push notifications, so that's something that will come out soon. And again, we were talking about the RTOS context, and like all of this is made much more difficult when you're dealing with trying to have CloudPhone scale that down to this experience here. So yeah, I do. So there's just a lot of like details to work that out to make that possible. And I'm trying to think of a couple of the other ones. Bluetooth is not available, and I don't think there's any plans in the near future to make Bluetooth available just because of how fragmented the Bluetooth chips are on these phones and the complexity of the Bluetooth stack. It would be super cool to have web Bluetooth, but it's just not like high on the priority list. I'm trying to think of other hardware. You can access the vibrator for vibrations, like for notifications. I'm trying to think of what other hardware. No web USB, no web XR, AR, none of that really makes sense on this platform. I don't know why you would need augmented reality on a little feature phone. I mean, it'd be kind of cool, but in the grand scheme of all the things we could build, probably not that important.
Well, I mean, it's what's interesting about that, I guess, is like, I guess another question I have is like, how much consideration has to go into every bit of hardware that goes on to these things then? So it's just something that kind of popped in my brain because I was thinking like, like I have a S23 Ultra here. It's got 5 cameras. And when you open the camera app, I mean, Samsung described it as it's already taking 4 trillion million billion pictures to get the HDR, whatever, blah, 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 tech speak. And then when you click the shutter, it takes 17,000 pictures and slams them together and makes a perfect image. Things like that. I mean, and then like we're talking about, making sure something's rendered by 128 by 128 for the podcast art, I think you mentioned there. So like, I mean, obviously Bluetooth, you mentioned like the complexity and the fragmentedness, but is price a big, I would imagine it is, right? Is price a big thing Because what I was thinking, like when you mentioned AR VR, is like, I mean, with an Android phone, especially with USB-C, like a lot of the time it's like, I have a game controller I can plug in. There's like camera, special camera things you can plug in, things like that, like accessories. But like these things, like if they only have 16 meg of RAM, like they're not going to be like, running some crazy camera array or that's why I said one frame a year or a week or whatever for like plug in my my AR or VR headset and like plug it into my dumb phone and just wait a day for a frame kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess I'll make a distinction between the hardware that these phones have that they're able to take advantage of, and then the hardware that Cloud Phone is able to take advantage of. So Bluetooth is available on many of these phones, and you can listen to podcasts by hooking up Bluetooth headphones. You could even hook up, like I've got AirPods in now. You could do that on these phones, and you could listen to your podcast from PodLP without having to have the web Bluetooth API, right? So the web Bluetooth API would give you access to like different GAT services and characteristics so that you could access BLE and be able to like create a service and broadcast, a message back and forth. That would be like if you were building an app that did like P2P connections between Bluetooth devices. But you don't need to worry about that for basic like headphones and stuff. That's just available within the operating system itself. Because price is important, yep, these obviously have limited hardware here. One of the phones I got here has 2 cameras. I don't know what they are. I think one is VGA, which is actually twice the screen's resolution, even though that sounds horrific by today's standards. I don't know what the other one is. I've got another one here. This one has a front-facing camera. Again, it's probably VGA. It's probably not very good, but it's good enough. I mean, it's better than the screen can output. And so it's like, it gets your image across. Grainy, probably, if you're chatting with your grandmother and you're on your ultra resolution iPhone or whatever S22 Ultra and she's looking at the image or you're looking at her image, it's probably not super high res, but it's enough. It's enough that you can see who you're talking to. So yeah, it really just comes down to like what the manufacturer, like what type of demographic they were going for as to what hardware they put in. I've seen ones with as many as 3 cameras. Some don't have cameras at all. So in terms of like what availability each device will have, it's going to work just like it would work with any web API. If you call like get user media, you'll get a list of devices. And if there's no devices, you get nothing. And so then you can just display something to the user that's like, hey, sorry, like you can't use this. Like you could build an AI augmented camera app. And I think that would actually be super cool to help. Like you could do AI super resolution, right? There's all these models now that will take a smaller image and make it higher res. You could do something like that where you have them take a picture, give a couple seconds to have the model render. Actually, the funny thing is, though, the models might render much faster because the images start so much smaller. So in some ways, you might actually be able to serve this demographic more affordably because they're not streaming high bitrate audio and high resolution images to your servers. They're streaming, pretty low resolution images and low bitrate audio.
That's super interesting, actually. Like, and that's a perfect example of like one of those niches that we've kind of discussed throughout the episode, where it's like, can somebody, clean up these images? If somebody takes like a really nice like image and they're on vacation or something, they want to send it to somebody who like, again, has like an S23 Ultra or whatever. It's like, oh, well, like here's an actual maybe 1080p image, right? Where it's like been up-resed, it like looks nice, it's been smoothed out, whatever, maybe some anti-aliasing, whatever needs to be done. And then it's like, you're getting like a pretty half decent image. Cause I remember back on actually my mom used to use like an older BlackBerry for quite some time. And she would send me pictures, usually like asking a question like, hey, like, is this, computer on or something? It's usually IT advice. And I would be like, what is that? Like, what did you take a picture of? Like, what is that thing? It's like 320 by whatever, it was an older BlackBerry model. And it's like, what are we looking at here? So
the possibilities are super cool. And I'll even give you an example. When we were talking about like user interface, I'll often provide guidance to developers who are trying to build for this platform for the first time. We get somebody who's building a file sharing app, and their initial version of the app that was targeting Cloud Phone had codes that were alphanumeric that they would send. And I actually made a suggestion. It was like, okay, so if you're doing, let's say, 4 alphanumeric digits, like this is what that maximum number of users is if you look at all possible values. And so I was like, what if you just took that number and made that an integer? And they're like, oh, why would I do that? Well, the user experience is 10 times easier. If you're typing on T9 and I have to go through every character, one, alphanumeric is probably not the right approach if you want a globally applicable audience, because like now you're assuming everyone knows the Roman character set and they know what these letters are. Whereas numbers are far more universal than letters. Even languages like Arabic are still using what we would consider what is called Arabic numerals, like 0 through 9. And so having a 4-digit alphanumeric sequence that you have to enter versus, let's say, 8 digits, 0 through 9, so much easier for the user. and far easier to localize and internationalize. So yeah, it's like little tweaks like that that you may not be paying attention to if you're in the smartphone world, because it's just so easy to pull up a virtual keyboard and be like, you know, A C49, whatever. But yeah, if you're on these phones, it's way easier to just type in 11023987.
100%. Well, especially if it's like one of those larger keypad phones, like we said, it's so easy. Just boop 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 boop. Here's my code. Here's my whatever. It just did numbers rather than being like, oh shoot, I actually typed one and it was supposed to be A. Like the corrections and everything would just be chaos, I would imagine.
Yeah, and it's just the anyone who's getting a phone has been introduced to the concept of numbers because of the phone number, and so you're sort of like you already have this mental model versus trying to give them a new concept. Like QR codes are pretty cool, but the funny thing with this demographic is because a lot of first-time internet users don't know what it is, you have to put instructions on the screen and say something like, take a picture of this screen to send this thing to your friend. And, nowadays with smartphones in the Western world, we're so used to QR codes. You see them at the restaurant, you just pull out your phone and boom, there's the menu. But if you're, a part of this demographic and this is the first time you've seen a phone, you're like, what's this like weird, crappy looking black and white square thing on my screen? Right? It makes no sense. If you don't know what it is,
Yeah.
you're just like, what on earth is this?
Especially if you don't have the camera, like if you only have a front facing, you're trying to like get that, trying to line it up without seeing the screen. Like it's like what? Not great. Now I do want to ask one question. So I know we like touched on, building potentially native apps and how like that's kind of, obviously more difficult. There's a lot of considerations. I know there's going to be somebody or maybe a very small group of people listening to this podcast that's now heard about this and is like, I would like to do, a native app. Can you give me any sort of like insight? Like I know we mentioned like a couple of things like KaiOS and like RTOS, and like the different, how it's, there's no real dev mode, things like that. Like what's the landscape for that? Just even if it's just like a surface level, because I know somebody listening is going to be like itching to try this now.
So yeah, if you're dead set that you want to build a native app for one of these RTOS-based flip phones, the short answer is you can't. And there's a variety of reasons. One is that there is actually no concept of apps. Even though they appear to be apps on the screen, they're actually just all bundled into the firmware together. So there's no distinction in memory space or anything else between your app and everything else on the operating system. So all that you basically know is that there's a scheduler that at any point might just axe whatever execution flow you've got, and it might restart it again, or it might never restart it. There's no file system. These phones don't have file systems. The exception being like they allow SD cards for expansion, and they will allow, I don't remember what the format is, but some file format that you can actually interface with if the user has added an SD card. But yeah, there's no API, there's no SDK. You can't just like go to Unisoc, which is one of the biggest chipsets manufacturers. Like you can't go to their website and like download an SDK and start building. You'd have to like establish a relationship with them and pay access to proprietary APIs and SDKs. You'd have to use like special development environments. You'd have to write your app in C and C++. You'd have to buy one of these like testing boards that they give to their partners. So you'd need like a special, basically it's like a stripped down phone. It's like just the chipset, like the system on a chip with a screen and stuff and some buttons. You need to get one of those. And then what you would do is you'd basically build the entire operating system with a tool chain, and you would flash it as the firmware to the phone to be able to test your device. And that would only get you Unisoc. And if you wanted ASR too, you'd have to then also do the whole thing over again for ASR. And if there's another chipset out there, you'd have to do the whole thing over again for them. And then, if you were going to go launch it, you'd have to pay attention to like, oh, okay, I've got a Unisoc T07, T107. What about the T127? Now I've got to like get that firmware, and I have to pull that branch in, and I have to, do merge conflicts and deal with like integrating my app into that firmware. So yeah, the short answer is like you really can't unless you are a commercial operation. You've got the capital and time to build business relationships, and you really want that longevity. But it is much, much harder to build a native app. And I'll give you just sort of like one more example for people who are like, maybe they're really in the weeds, they're hacker types, and like, oh, I really want to make this work. One of the big challenges with building native apps, even on KaiOS, where they're still web apps, was root certificate expiration for SSL. So if you want to make an HTTP request in KaiOS, you can use XHR, or 3.0 has fetch. But the way that SSL certificate signing works is that you have these root certificate authorities who issue certain root certificates that were added to the device to basically say, like, is this a validly issued SSL cert? And Let's Encrypt is a hugely popular one because it's free. You can go to Let's Encrypt and you can basically use their service to sign your own keys so that you can have a free SSL cert for your domain and have everything accessible via HTTPS. But when those root certs expire, the device will treat the certificate as invalid, and you'll get one of those scary screens that's like, warning, do not proceed, blah, 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 this is insecure. And KaiOS had that happen, and a lot of things use Let's Encrypt. Like Wikipedia, the Wikipedia app just did not work anymore because if you work in web development, if you're doing an XHR request, there's no error that you're provided for an invalid cert. You just get failure to connect. So it looks the same as if it were like a CORS issue or something else where you just were never allowed to connect to the server. All of these things are stuff that you have to start paying attention to if you're building a native app. Versus because Cloud Phone renders on a server, you don't need to worry about that. We'll update all the root certs for you. It doesn't matter who you're hosting with. So it's a very different development experience. There's so many fewer gotchas. Or another one would be like in KaiOS, if you're going to support India, you have to support IPv6 only mode, which means that these phones, because there's so few IPv4 addresses available to emerging markets, they don't have NAT64, they don't have DNS64, so there's no backwards compatibility layer. As a dev, that means that your server needs to handle IPv6 fully. It needs to have quad A records. It needs to have, dual stack networking to be able to handle connections through IPv6. And that poses problems for people. Like all of these things suddenly start coming into play, all these low level concerns that as a web developer, you don't really think about today. So yeah, I would just say the delta between building a web app on Cloud Phone and a native app for one of these phones is massive. And you would need a very good reason to want to overcome all of those hurdles to really be worth your time and effort.
I'm glad you mentioned the hacker types because like I knew that's exactly who I was thinking of as someone who's going to be like, I can get, Doom working on this graphing calculator or God knows what. And I just figured like someone out there would be like, I'm going to get, my whatever, like my AI chat app to work on these things natively though. Like it's going to work perfect. It's like, I don't know, man.
Well, so if you're the hacker type and you want to mess around with one of these phones, but you don't have the time or patience or money to do everything I was talking about building a native app on them, another thing you could do is use WebAssembly, compile your native code, like you could target WebAssembly for Doom, and then just test it on your own device. It might not be a good app that we would want to publish for a variety of reasons. Mostly real-time games do not work on Cloud Phone because it's server-side rendering. The frame rate's restricted to about 20. It's not limited. It's not like there's a cap that we provide, but like just based on networking latencies on like stable 4G, you're not really going to get more than 20 frames per second. So if you're building a real-time game, and then like the classic examples, like you're on a train, you go under a tunnel for a few minutes, your connection's gone. So real-time games are not well suited for Cloud Phone. But like if you just want to play around and experiment, by all means, like, take Doom and compile it to WASM and ship it as a binary and put it on GitHub pages and handle the keyboard bindings and mess around and see what you can do. Yeah, there's a ton of, like I said, I can't even imagine all the use cases that are coming. I'm definitely like super excited to see like what crazy ideas people come up with. And it's a pretty wild time to have all the tools of the web available at your fingertips to be able to serve, millions of feature phone users and not have to worry about all the crazy hardware and networking stuff that I talked about.
Absolutely. I mean, it's something that, I mean, like you said, like if you were to try to like go into the native like app kind of thing, it's like you're shifting your whole like idea, right? It's like we kind of have an idea of like modern web development and development where it's like, a web developer might say, I'm going to go become an app developer. And they don't mean, for like one of these big manufacturers where they, sort of make the firmware for the quote unquote apps that are on these feature phones. These people are talking about shipping an APK and, going on Swift and writing something native for iPhone, things like that. It's like a different idea. So like, it's cool that like Cloud Phone kind of like bridges this gap where it's like, hey, you can't be as hacky as you want necessarily, like kind of like what we already mentioned. But I mean, there's, you can still either take advantage of the market or, play around like you mentioned with Doom to get it working. And I mean, that transitions perfectly into, like I'm in Canada. I believe you're in New Zealand. We got listeners all over the world. Where can they get like a flip phone? Like what type of flip phone? Is there specific cloud phones? If they do want to start playing with this thing, if they do have a web app that they want to ship on Cloud Phone and they want to have the physical thing and not just the emulator slash simulator. What's the sort of process of that? Like, where can they pick these up?
Yeah, so basically just go to developer.cloudphone.com, Phone again, and there's a devices tab, and you can see all the devices that are available today. And if you're on that website, there's links to our email, there's links to all of our social media. So yeah, send us a message, and we're happy to be able to provide you with a free 4G developer phone. Hopefully, in the near future, we'll have a Wi-Fi based one too. So yeah, we give out developer phones again because they're affordable, and we want to give people put hardware in their hands so that they can actually test their test their apps on a real device. And yeah, that's really the short answer. The longer answer is it's a little bit harder if you start like typing in different device models and stuff. You'll go down a rabbit hole to figure out like which ones have what features and which ones have Cloud Phone, which ones don't, which ones run KaiOS, which ones run this Unisoc RTOS, which have Android. And to make things really confusing, different manufacturers will change the operating system and platform based on like the country that you're in. So like if you get the Barbie phone, it runs KaiOS in the United States, but in the rest of the world, it runs what they call S30 Plus, which is Nokia's version of Unisoc's RTOS. So yeah, basically, if you want to avoid going down the rabbit hole and like looking through 1,000 different flip phone models, go to our website, look at the list. If there's nothing that's available in your country, or you just want a developer phone, reach out to us. More than happy to send them. And yeah, pretty easy to get playing and to mess around with these things.
No, that's great. I hope someone in our audience does reach out and starts kind of playing with this stuff, because it is kind of cool, and it would be cool for someone to capture some of that emerging market, or maybe they have a cool idea for their, their, I don't know, their grandpa or something. If they have like a cool app that they think would run well on, a phone that would be accessible to him, like that'd be kind of cool. Things like that in various niches that as we've discussed throughout the episode. Well, Tom, I want to say, thanks for being on the show. Absolutely. It's been a great chat. It's cool kind of diving back into the phone space. Like I said, I worked at BlackBerry for a number of years, and so it's really cool kind of jumping back in to this sort of world. And I'd like to invite you at this point to just sort of like take the floor, just plug whatever you want, discuss whatever you want. If there's any links, I know you provided some here, which will be in the show notes, but if there's anything else, we'll absolutely put those on the show notes on htmlallthethings.com.
Yeah, again, thank you for having me. And I guess I would say if you're a developer that's just, you already know the web, I would say explore the space. If for nothing else, it's just so much easier to build something that actual people will use. When I was building Model P, I remember I was looking for inspiration because I didn't know how podcasts worked, but I'd been building for Android for years. And I remember going on GitHub and seeing, I honestly couldn't tell you, hundreds, maybe thousands of repos of people who built a podcast app for Android. And it's cool. It's like a demo app that anyone can build. You don't pay, content licensing, so you just get access to all this stuff. So it's a good way to learn. But there's like a graveyard of apps that have probably never had more than 100 users. So if you want something that's going to be used by actual people that you can test your ideas, you can put in front of them, yeah, absolutely try the feature phone space. Because there's so few apps compared to the 3 million on Android or however many million on Apple, it's so much easier to stand out. You don't have to pay any fees. And it's actually surprisingly easy to build for these screens because they're so small and there's so few, there's a lot less that they can do. You're not dealing with like building complex swipe gestures and transition animations and all that stuff. You really just focus on like the core content and then arranging it simply and having it accessible via keyboard navigation. So yeah, if you're interested, again, reach out, cloudphone.com. You can access links to our dev site, our developer console. We've got a subreddit, r/cloudphone, a Discord server, all these different ways that you can message us. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn, like how I connected with you. You can find us on GitHub. So yeah, there's just, more than happy to hear everybody's ideas and help them get building.
That's great. And like I said, just for the listener out there, all those links will be on htmlallthethings.com in the show notes, so go and check it out. Grab yourself a cloud phone, feature phone, whichever, and start building, start playing with stuff, and see if you can capture some emerging markets and maybe like help them out, even like we said, by filling in some functionality gaps, new ideas, niche ideas, all sorts of great stuff. Well, Tom, I mean, it's been great chatting with you. I'm really glad that you could be on the show, and it was a great conversation. I hope the audience loves it. I'm sure they will.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Now, I hope that you enjoyed that interview as much as we did, and I hope that you actually jump at the opportunity of potentially bringing your website or web app or modern app to a feature or flip phone using Cloud Phone. Like we said in the interview, you can actually get your hands on one for free, whether that be a physical device or actually, test out via their simulator/emulator. Please go check that out. Maybe you want to, take advantage of the emerging market and you want to have your app accessible there, or maybe you're just like a hacker / tinkerer and you want to try that out, or even more, maybe even more important, arguably, you maybe just want to have modern features, more modern things in the hands of people that are kind of forced to be in this price bracket, on these lower budget phones. And that would be a super cool sort of cause to get behind. So please go and check out cloudphone.com. Again, all those links that Tom described will be in the show notes on htmlallthethings.com. And remember that if you want to support episodes like this, you can do so on Patreon. That's patreon.com/htmlallthethings. Check out the tiers and give that a go. And many thanks to our $3 tier patrons: Tim from the Web Hacker on thewebhacker.com, Jason from Geek Life Radio via geekliferadio.com, Garrett Segal, Level Up Financial Planning via www.levelupfinancialplanning.com, Magnus from YesWeb via yesweb.se, Syntaxify from the HTML All the Things Discord server, and Stacy Mosteler from the website swoonworthydesigns.com. And we'd also like to give a shout out to Michael LaRocca, a contributing author on htmlallthethings.com. Michael is the author of Self-Taught the X Generation blog at selftaughttxg.com. Feel free to leave a comment or review in the platform that you are listening to this on, and this outro will sign us off.
You've been listening to HTML All the Things podcast. Web development, web design, and small business. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information from this show. And we hope you appreciate that we talk to you like human beings. And we hope you had some fun. We'll be back soon. But in the meantime, hit us up on social media on Facebook, Instagram, and Patreon at HTML All the Things. And on Twitter at HTML Everything. Until next time, this is HTML All the Things, signing off.